Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Jeff Morgan, Managing Director at Deloitte's Life Science Practice. So you might be wondering why an audit firm or a tax firm is here talking about healthcare, but we're much bigger than our legacy tax and audit practices. Deloitte Consulting is actually the largest life science and healthcare consultancy in the world. We serve almost every major payer, provider, manufacturer, and by serve them, we're working on some of the biggest challenges that they face today, whether it's optimizing revenue, how to bring drugs to market quicker, how to implement electronic health records. We're one of the largest implementers of electronic health records. So we do a lot of work throughout the healthcare ecosystem. And it was great to see the World Congress put on this session on this topic. We call it a signature issue, and that's something that we use to describe one of the biggest challenges our clients are facing in life sciences and healthcare, and that being how are we going to transition from this volume-based model to a value-based model, inclusive for drugs. So that's kind of what my talk's going to focus on, is value-based models for drugs. And since data, and there's a lot of talk about data today, data's really going to underpin these new models, so I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that we see with data as it relates to these value-based contracts. So my talk's going to cover three main topics. I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff we're seeing in the market today, and why we're seeing it, and specific around the types of metrics that we're seeing. I'm going to talk about an initiative that we've launched to try to overcome some of the barriers, and specifically around the data barrier itself, and then talk about opportunities to streamline the entire value-based contracting process. So why now? Why now are we seeing such great interest in value-based contracts? I think in the last 2 years, we've seen more publicly announced value-based contracts in the last 2 years than we did in the previous 10. So there's a lot of interest and excitement around this topic, and there's some major trends driving it. So none of this should be new to anybody here, but healthcare spending continues to grow at an unsustainable rate. So from 3.5 trillion in 2017, which was almost 18% of GDP, to an estimated 5.7 trillion, to an estimated 20% of GDP by 2026. So that's not sustainable. At the same time, the cost of developing new drugs continues to rise. R&D productivity continues to go down in the pharmaceutical industry. The cost of bringing a drug to market is now estimated at $2.7 billion, and that's taking into account the time it takes to get through the R&D process and regulatory approval, and also takes into account failures. And a lot of this is being driven by the types of drugs that we're seeing developed. So the drugs are being more personalized and tailored, which makes their trials more complex and time-consuming, and patients harder to find. So that's straining R&D budgets within the industry. A lot of talk about pricing earlier today. We had ICER up here talking about it, but that criticism around drug pricing isn't going away. There's been numerous bills submitted to help either control or reduce the cost of drugs. Even one most recently submitted by Speaker Pelosi last month, I think it was called Reduce Drug Prices Now Act of 2019, where she wants to empower HHS to be able to negotiate the price of some of the top 125 most expensive drugs. And earlier this year, we also saw 7 CEOs of major pharmaceutical companies testified before the Senate Finance Committee around drug pricing. And many of them cited value-based contracting as one or as a part of the solution to help control costs. I think someone said it earlier. It's not going to be the silver bullet, but it's going to be one of the levers that we're going to need to pull to help control drug costs. And finally, we're seeing tremendous advancements in technology. So we're seeing tremendous innovation with cloud computing. We're seeing emerging standards such as FHIR with electronic health records that's making accessing and exchanging data easier now more than ever before. And you look at like an example of what Apple has done with their health record, where they're empowering patients to essentially take possession of their health record on their cell phone with a few clicks, and have the ability to then share that information with others. So all this is really driving us to those value-based models. And when you look at the drugs that are coming down the pipeline, you're seeing an increased number of specialty medications, which is going to continue to strain those precious healthcare dollars. This is from 2018, I believe. 2018, only 2% of prescriptions were written for specialty medications, but they accounted for 50% of all drug spend. When you look at the growth of that drug spend, it's averaging 10% year over the last 5 years. And when these drugs come to market, they have a pretty high price tag. So as of 2019, there's over 23 products that has an annual price of over $300,000. And this year we saw our first $1 million drug, and then our first $2 million drug. So these trends aren't going away. And actually kind of dwarfs I remember a few years ago when Gilead launched their first Hep C drug, and I think it was $84,000, and that had Congress have a hearing over it. And $84,000 now for a drug doesn't seem that bad, relatively speaking. So this kind of all underpins or underscores the fact that our reimbursement model needs to catch up with the innovation. So this is a quote I heard at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference earlier this year. We're in the Star Trek era of medicines with the Flintstones reimbursement system, and I actually heard it a couple hours ago. I don't know if John Doyle's in the room. He had a version of this. I actually don't know who this quote originated from, because I had it listed in a blog I wrote a couple of weeks ago, and people were emailing me saying, thank you for using my quote, but I had like 4 people. But it just kind of underscores that we need to modernize our reimbursement system for the 21st century medicines that we're bringing to market. Today we largely pay for volume of interventions and not the health benefit. We need to start paying for better health and not more health care. So where are we seeing kind of interest and exploration with value-based contracts today? So this is a survey of, I believe it was 25 pharmacy directors of health plans, health systems, and PBMs. The dark shaded blue on the left there, they were asked, where do you have a VBC in place today, or expect to have one by the end of 2018? So this data is a little bit dated. But as you can see, cardiovascular, diabetes, rheumatology, chronic diseases kind of rose to the top of the list. The same group of individuals were asked, where would you be willing to put into place a VBC over the next 3 years? So where else do you want to go with these? That's the next shade of blue there in the middle. You can start to see that it spreads across almost every therapeutic area. The biggest ones being oncology, immunology, and gastrointestinal. So you're going to see VBCs, and I think we're starting to see it already. They're moving out of the era of chronic diseases into more of these specialty medications. Despite this interest and activity, there's a lot of barriers preventing them from scaling. A lot of them have been cited today. This is some results from a survey we did last year where we asked 20 manufacturers what are the biggest barriers preventing you from entering into value-based contracting. And the number one barrier cited on the left was around the data. So challenges with collecting, linking, and analyzing the necessary data. There's also the next one was around gaining alignment for the right product, population, and outcomes metric. So not every drug is a good fit for a value-based contract. And we'll go more into that in a little bit. And then a close third was complexities of assigning value to the benefit. So that's really essentially, is there enough skin in the game in this contract to make it worth the while? I mean, these barriers are all very real, but they're not insurmountable. We want to take a look at, with this activity, we want to see what are the outcomes or the metrics that are being used as the basis. So we looked at the 23 of the most recent publicly announced VBCs where we could get some detail on them. We categorized them into either utilization-based, persistence, adherence-based, or clinical. So the most prevalent type of metric that we're seeing, at least in the publicly announced ones, are utilization-based. That's where they're measuring something like total cost of the patient or measuring a healthcare resource utilization. Persistence-based was persistence and adherence. We kind of bundled those together. Was the next one. So that's measuring either how long a patient stays on a medication before they discontinue it, or adherence-based is are they taking it according to doctor's orders, right? Are they taking it daily, twice a day, et cetera? The last one being clinical endpoints. So that looked more around how patients feel, function, or survive. And a lot of people will argue that those are some of the more meaningful outcomes, depending on who the stakeholder is. So if you're a patient, that's probably the most meaningful thing to you. And to look just a little bit deeper at these metrics, these are some examples from contracts, and they're blinded. So utilization-based, so a cardiovascular drug that looked at rehospitalization rates for repeat acute coronary events, or diabetes drug that measured the total cost of care on a per member per month basis compared to patients on their drug versus patients who are not. Persistence, an example of a psoriasis drug measuring how long a patient stayed on the treatment compared to a set benchmark, and some of those benchmarks are typically what's seen in a clinical trial. A neurologic drug that measured if a patient discontinued treatment within the first 90 days. So that's essentially like a surrogate for did it work. The assumption is that if the patient stops within 90 days, the drug's not working or there's an adverse event. Adherence, so this adherence example is actually a combination of adherence and persistence. So an osteoporosis drug where it's measuring if a patient is taking the medication as prescribed, so taking it daily for a specific duration of therapy, so 2 years. The one common thread between these three metrics is that they're all essentially being measured from claims data, which is sufficient for these types of measures, but there's a lot of limitations to what you can measure with claims data. So we need to go beyond this if we're going to start measuring, if we're going to start seeing value-based contracts on a wider scale. That's kind of where we get into the clinical endpoints, and this example is around an oncology drug that looked at measuring progression-free survival compared to what was observed in a clinical trial. And I'm going to actually do a case study on this one to show you how, so you could compare how much more complex it is compared to just measuring medical possession ratio to calculate adherence. So this is a case study. So it's a manufacturer entered into a value-based contract with a non-profit health plan looking at patients with non-small cell lung cancer. And when they went into this arrangement, there were kind of 4 critical or keys to success. They understood that this agreement's going to take a lot longer and a lot more time and effort to set up, so they needed commitment from leadership. They also understood that they needed to select the right product and metrics, because not every drug and diseases lends itself to value-based contracts. So they needed to pick a drug that had measurable outcomes in a relatively short period of time, that could be obtained relatively easily and defined objectively. And the aspects around the data could be very daunting, so they had to balance the specificity of the contract with simplicity. And what I mean by that is you couldn't make it so cumbersome and overbearing that either party would say this is just not going to work, we can't do it. And lastly is around government price reporting. So the manufacturer had to take into account the potential impact of this arrangement to their reporting for things like 340B, Medicaid best price, and ASP. So how did they do it? So a little more details on the outcome. So it's progression-free survival for first-line use for non-small cell lung cancer. So in that phase, in that one bullet there's a whole bunch of assumptions. So it was assumed it was first-line treatment if in the look-back period, they went in the data to look back 6 months. If there was no prior oncology agent used in that 6 months, they assumed it was first-line treatment. They also assumed the patients were stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer because that was the indication for this drug. They set the PFS benchmark at 6 months, which was a little bit less than what was seen in the clinical trials, but they rounded down just to make the measurement easier. And so the financial mechanism was set up as essentially like a sliding scale. So it was measured at the patient level, it wasn't at a population level. So patients were their progression-free survival was measured based on persistence on the medication. So if the patient stayed on the medication for at least 6 months, it was determined that their disease did not progress and that threshold was met. If within 6 months the patient had discontinued, a rebate was potentially due. But there were some kind of carve-outs with that rebate. So if the patient discontinued because of toxicity or disease progression, a rebate was due. If it was physician or provider preference, they were excluded from the contract. So you wonder, how did they ascertain that from claims data? They couldn't, right? So that level of detail wasn't in claims data. They had to go to a local health information exchange to get access to electronic health record data. So if Jeff had if I discontinued 4 months in, they went to the HIE to find my electronic health record and then look for pathology reports confirming progression or toxicity levels. If that wasn't in my record there, they went to infusion centers to see if they could find it. If it wasn't in there and the electronic data wasn't available, they contacted the physician's offices to potentially do manual extraction. So you kind of see how it gets pretty complex, right? Okay. So, you know, despite these inherent complexities, it was viewed as a success. But the way they defined success from the onset was learnings. It wasn't a financial success that they were targeting. It was, can we come together and think through all the clinical, operational, contractual challenges we're going to face to effectively get through this pilot. This, you know, during this pilot, they forged a stronger strategic relationship because stakeholders from both organizations came together and were committed to being part of a solution, seeing if they could figure this out together. They did mention that, you know, these types of arrangements, you know, they're really only going to be impactful if you could scale them, and that's going to take collaboration. And no one payer, manufacturer, or provider could really do this single-handedly. So that kind of leads us into what we've been doing at Deloitte to try to overcome some of these barriers and make these more scalable and efficient. So we've been bringing, this started last September. We've been bringing stakeholders together from across the healthcare ecosystem in what we call value exchange summits. We bring together about 25 to 30 stakeholders in a day-long session with representatives from manufacturers, health plans, providers, and even patient organizations to talk about the challenges and opportunities with value-based contracting. You know, the overarching goal of the summit is to really create a roadmap for the future of value-based contracts that are going to positively impact patients' outcomes, help control costs, and reward value. So it starts off with just, you know, one of the key objectives is like, what should value-based contracts look like in the future? I think everyone agrees that what we see today is good progress, but it's not like where we need to go. So we need to envision what the future looks like where it's mainstream. And then we align on the barriers preventing us from making that a reality. And then we start to develop a plan together to overcome those barriers and then identify areas of mutual interest to collaborate. So these summits aren't kind of a one snapshot in time event. The goal is to have these events to then kick off longer collaborations across these ecosystems that we're putting together. And this just kind of, as the slide talks about the approach, it's just to highlight, it's not like death by 1,000 PowerPoints, right? It's a working session. People come in, you're envisioning tomorrow, we work in working groups to overcome today and drive accountability, right? There's no slides, we're breaking off into groups that are made up of a diverse set of stakeholders from manufacturers to health plans, so everyone could kind of get each other's perspectives in real time. And here's some insights from actually, this was the last summit we held in September. It was September 18th we held it. We surveyed the participants before they came in to get their insights on VBCs within their organizations. And about 80% of the participants said that value-based contracts for drugs were a top 10 priority within their organization, which if you contrast that to what we saw about a year ago, that number was much lower. So it's definitely starting to gain traction within organizations. The areas where participants felt they could have the biggest impact were around gene therapies and immuno-oncology agents. And we also asked these organizations or participants from these organizations, like, how would you rate the level of maturity of your internal capabilities? Are they at a state where they are mature enough to scale value-based contracts widely across your organization? And the vast majority of them said no, 92% no. And the number one area that they cited that needed to be improved was around the technology. So overcoming that data barrier, the challenges with managing, collecting, and analyzing the necessary data. Okay, so there's a common theme from the first summit, which was last November, to this summit, which was last September. There's two separate groups. There was no overlapping stakeholders, so it's about 70 stakeholders in all was that this concept of an industry utility has emerged. So instead of each organization trying to build up the internal capabilities to do this at scale, whether that's building up the infrastructure, the people, and the processes to do it, or doing it off the side of your desk, can we come together and build a shared platform where multiple parties could come in and leverage that same infrastructure and processes, essentially start to streamline the data collection, analysis, and reporting that's needed for this. And the ultimate goal is really to take us from where we are today, which essentially we're making do with what we have, whether it's legacy systems, adding it to someone else's job requirements, to where we need to go, which is a more sustainable and efficient model for value-based contracts. We have to get away from the highly fragmented approach that we see on the market today, where each value-based contract looks a little different. It could be for the same disease area, but it looks a little different from drug A to drug B for the same disease area, and it could be operationalized a little bit differently. So that just causes a lot of friction and inefficiency in the system. We need to start to standardize and have a more consistent approach to defining these metrics and then measuring them. And then as far as the processes, we need to start to strip out as many of the manual processes that we have today. It's just too time consuming. I think earlier, on one of the earlier panels, someone asked, how long does it take you to set up and operationalize a VBC? And I think they said that the shortest it had been was 6 months, and some of them have been over a year. Like that's not a sustainable model. So we need to start to strip out as much of those inefficiencies as possible and develop a systematic way to do this. And technology could help. This is a place where technology could help with the automation, whether it's around data ingestion, quality checking the data, data linkage, data analysis, being able to compress the time it takes to do many of those activities. We have technology today that could help. And the thinking is that this utility will start to instill more trust with these relationships through transparency and objectivity, with the ultimate goal of really doing VBCs in a more sustainable way that takes less time and effort. So it's my view that there's significant opportunity to streamline the entire process. And there's 3 keys to success. We have to come together, collaborate early and often. We have to create value for all stakeholders involved. We have to develop those repeatable processes and systems. I believe we're still in that early experimentation phase for value-based contracts. So these should be more of a collaboration and less of a transactional relationship. The goal should really be to get multiple stakeholders together to collaborate, to co-develop and pilot so that we could learn how to do this in a more efficient way. And I always think I come from a software background, and if anyone's familiar with software, the concept of Agile Software development, we could steal some of the key principles from that, which is essentially, work quickly to get something out there that's valuable, recognizing that it may be imperfect and the environment around us is going to continue to change, but we need to be able to react quickly and adapt to that. And these agreements need to create value for all stakeholders, and that values could look differently based on the stakeholder type, whether it's a provider, a payer, or a patient. We need to make sure that there's enough skin in the game for all stakeholders so that they'll be engaged. And lastly, it's those repeatable processes and systems that I've been talking about. In the absence of those, value-based contracts will continue to be very cumbersome and time-consuming. And my view is we'll still see very slow progress getting to those disease areas where we think it can make the most meaningful impact. We need to not try to boil the ocean at first. We have to start with 1 to 2 high prioritized disease areas to figure this out and then scale those learnings across other disease areas. And this is kind of the main goal of the Value Exchange Summits and the efforts we're doing. It's like, how can we come together to collaborate around this to solve? Because it's no one payer, provider, or manufacturer is going to be able to do this themselves. So that's the end of my presentation. If anyone, so we have some summaries of our Value Exchange Summit there in the back. If anyone's interested in getting a little more detail on one of the outputs of it, happy to pass those around, but I guess I'll open it up for questions now if anyone has some questions. Yes, you may.
Hi, Christian Reich, QVIA. This is nice overview, nice introduction, at least for me. So I understand what you're trying to do and like make it formal and make it systematic and get people's act together. But how do you fundamentally avoid the problem that as soon as money gets attached to an outcome, that this will change the game? Okay. How do you avoid? How do you solve the problem that you not only can not easily get the information, or it becomes so bureaucratic that almost the value-based the benefits from a value-based contract is going to be taken away by just being able to chase down the information? And how do you avoid that the information is not going to be, if there's lots of money in it, tweaked in such a way that you can actually make it robust, right? Because in the old system, it's clear who got it, and it's clear what the cost is, and there's no discussion.
Yep, no, it's a great question, and we don't have it all figured out yet. But it's, I think it's, in today's model, one side of the equation keeps score, right? So there is a black box, right? So if we could make an improvement by at least having more transparency into the data, right? So at least both sides have view into the potential biases and limitations and quality issues of the data. There'll be a little more transparency and trust there, where I think we could start to alleviate some of the concerns you have. But how do we get to a state where it's perfect data? That's a work in progress. Any other questions?
I might just ask it out loud here. One question on the data barrier. What are your thoughts on addressing, always comes up that there are concerns about privacy of the data and patient health privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Just either from the Value Exchange Summit or what your thoughts on addressing that?
Yeah, no, it's a very real consideration that has to be taken into account. So, there's ways to, obviously, there's ways to protect patient-level de-identified data. So data can be de-identified whether it's before it leaves the individual systems. If we're linking data across data sources, there's a higher risk of re-identification of the patient. So there's, essentially techniques to just provide summary results, so aggregate it up to a certain level where it's less likely to prevent re-identification of patients. But I think, in the utility model that's being discussed is, it may not be access to raw underlying de-identified data. It might be access to summary data, which helps with a lot of that. Any other questions? All right. Okay, thank you.